I'm Ben McGorm. This is Wild Harvest. When hunting comes up in public conversation in Australia, it rarely arrives as a full picture. Most people don't encounter it through direct experience. They encounter it through moments. A photo, a news story, or something shared online. A clip that's taken from the end of a much longer process. And what reaches them is usually the part where something visible's already happened, right? From a distance, those moments look decisive. Something's occurred. There's an animal on the ground. There's a person holding a rifle. And a situation that invites an immediate reaction without requiring much context. And I think depending on who's looking, that reaction can be very different. I think for some people, hunting feels like something from another era. A leftover from a time when survival depended on skills that modern life has made unnecessary. And in a country where most food arrives packaged and predictable, hunting can look out of place. Not dangerous exactly, just, I guess, outdated. And something that doesn't belong in a society that prides itself on being modern and urban. For others, the judgment is sharper. It isn't just old-fashioned, it's wrong. Killing animals for recreation. Violence presented as tradition. Something that shouldn't be happening at all, regardless of whether it's legal or regulated or done carefully. From that perspective, the details don't matter much. The act itself is enough to condemn it. Now, those views are clear, and they tend to travel easily because they don't require much explanation. But there's also another group that rarely gets talked about. Most people simply don't think about hunting at all. It isn't a part of their daily lives. It doesn't affect their decisions. Many Australians don't realise how widespread deer populations are in certain areas, or that they're officially managed as pests in several states. Hunting doesn't feel controversial to them because it barely registers as something that exists nearby. So when it does appear, it's usually unexpected. It's a headline, or a viral post, or something a friend mentions in passing. And those isolated moments become the reference point. Not because anyone's trying to mislead them, but because there isn't much else to balance them against. Hunting looks like a series of outcomes. It's a shot fired or an animal taken. A clear event with a beginning and an end. What you don't see are the hours or days or years that made that moment possible. Or the countless situations where nothing happened at all. Because those parts, well, they don't travel well. A quiet morning where you walked for 4 hours and saw nothing doesn't become a story. Sitting long enough for the bush to settle around you, it doesn't produce an image that means anything to someone who wasn't there. Walking away from an opportunity because it didn't feel right leaves no visible trace whatsoever. So what circulates publicly is a compressed version. It's louder and cleaner and more decisive. It's focused on outcomes rather than process. And I don't think that makes public perception dishonest. It just means that most people are seeing the highlights of something that is mostly not highlights. Earlier in the season, I talked about a hesitation I noticed in myself whenever hunting came up in conversation. It's not fear and it's not shame, just a small pause while I worked out how to answer. A kind of internal calibration before speaking. Now, at the time, I didn't have a clear explanation for it. I assumed it was about how hunting sits socially in Australia, or uncertainty around how it would land, I guess. At the time, I didn't have a clear explanation for it. I assumed it was about how hunting sits socially in Australia, or uncertainty around how it would land. Now, a little bit further along my journey, it makes a bit more sense. It's not because I've resolved it, and not because I've suddenly found the perfect way to talk about it. It's more because I've realised that, well, hunting doesn't reduce cleanly into something easy to summarise without losing important parts of what it actually is. If you describe only the outcome, it sounds way harsher than it feels. And if you describe only the philosophy, it sounds abstract. And if you describe everything, most people just lose the thread. So you end up searching for a version that feels honest without flattening the experience or turning it into something that it isn't. And I think early on, I didn't trust myself to do that very well. I was still trying to figure out what hunting meant to me, still learning what mattered and what didn't. Still aware of how easy it would be to say something that sounded confident but actually wasn't that grounded yet. So hesitation filled the gap. And it's not because I was hiding anything, it's because I didn't feel settled enough to represent it properly. And that shifted a little over the course of this season of podcasting. I guess not dramatically and not in a way that feels final, but just enough experience, I guess, accumulated that some of the unknowns are now familiar. I mean, I'm still learning. I'm still making mistakes and I'm still finding things out the slow way. But I think I'm less concerned about saying the wrong thing and more interested in saying something that's true to where I am right now, even if that position continues to change over time. In this episode, it's not really about correcting public perception or arguing for a particular view. It's about describing what it feels like to live inside the gap between the version that circulates publicly and the version that you actually experience day to day. Because once you spend enough time in that space, you start to see that the two versions aren't really competing with each other. They're shaped by completely different conditions. One view is built from observation at a distance, and the other is built from participation up close. Neither one is entirely wrong. Neither one is complete. And I'm not speaking as someone who claims to represent hunting as a whole. That's not what I'm doing here. Or as someone who's spent a lifetime doing this. I'm speaking as someone who came to it later, struggled more than expected, stayed long enough for things to become familiar, and is now comfortable within the limits of that experience. I know what it feels like from the inside. At least the small part of it I've lived so far. I also know how different that can look from the outside. The rest of this episode is simply an attempt to place those two realities next to each other without pretending they should match perfectly. What I realised over time is that none of those public impressions are completely wrong. They're just incomplete. To understand why, you have to look at what hunting actually feels like from the inside. Not at its most dramatic, but on an ordinary day when nothing remarkable happens. The version of hunting I live most of the time wouldn't hold anyone's attention from the outside. There's no constant tension. There's no sense that something important's about to happen. If you filmed most of it honestly, the footage would look like a person walking slowly, stopping a lot, then walking again. Occasionally I sit down. Occasionally I look through binoculars at something that turns out to be absolutely nothing. It doesn't feel dramatic when you're in it either. Honestly, it just feels like being somewhere for a long time with a purpose that might not lead anywhere. Most days start in the dark, but not in a heroic way. Just early enough that you'd still be asleep if there wasn't a reason to be up. It's coffee while the house is quiet, or around the swags in the morning. Gear you laid out the night before or in the back of the ute so that you don't have to think too much. A drive through empty back roads where nothing feels significant yet. By the time you step out of the vehicle, the place doesn't feel charged or cinematic. Honestly, it feels indifferent. It's cold if it's in winter. Damp if it's rained overnight. It's still if the wind hasn't picked up yet. Whatever it happens to be, it's not tailored to your plans. You stand there for a moment, partly to let your eyes adjust and partly to listen and just start becoming one with the environment you're walking into. Partly because once you start walking, you're committed to being inside of it for a while. Then you move. Not fast, not directly, just slowly enough that you don't push everything ahead of you. The aim isn't to cover ground efficiently. It's to move in a way that keeps options open. Stop often. Check the wind without making a show of it. Look into places where an animal could be rather than where you hope one would be. And after a while, your internal pace drops to match the surroundings. You stop thinking in terms of getting somewhere and start thinking in terms, I guess, of not disturbing what's already there. Hours can pass like that. Sometimes you see signs, tracks or droppings or places where animals have been feeding. Proof that you're not imagining things. But sign doesn't guarantee presence. Just means that something was there at some point, under conditions that may not exist anymore. So you keep moving. Every now and again you stop for longer. Not because you're tired, but because staying still makes you less intrusive. And the bush behaves differently when you stop forcing your way through it. Sounds return. Birds that are moving in that pre-dawn darkness are moving normally again. Things that were hidden by motion become visible simply because you're no longer adding noise. Sitting like that doesn't feel like waiting for something to happen. It feels like allowing something to happen if it was going to anyway. And often, nothing does. No dramatic nothing. Not frustrating nothing. Just uneventful time passing. You're alert, but you're not tense. You're present, but not expectant. You're aware that the day might end exactly like this, and it wouldn't be unusual if it did. If animals do appear, it's rarely sudden. More often, it's a shape resolving out of the background. Something that looked like part of the landscape until it moved slightly differently than everything else. And that's when your attention narrows. Not because you're excited, but because now the situation matters. This is where the outside perception diverges the most from the inside experience. Because from the outside, it looks like the moment the hunt begins. And from the inside, it's the moment a series of checks begins. Distance, wind direction, whether the animal's aware of you, what's behind it, whether you can approach it safely, whether you can recover it if it runs, whether the conditions are stable enough to justify acting at all. And each one of these can quietly rule the situation out. Sometimes you watch for minutes while the opportunity dissolves on its own. The wind shifts, or the animal moves into thicker cover. Another animal appears that complicates things. Sometimes it just feels off in a way you can't easily explain. Then the animal walks away. No shot, no noise, no visible outcome. From the outside, nothing happened. From inside it, though, a decision happened. And most of the time, that decision is to not act. And that's probably the hardest part to convey to people who don't hunt. Restraint isn't a rare moral triumph, it's the default setting. Acting is the exception. Even on days when animals are present, you may go home having taken nothing simply because none of the situations felt clean enough. And that doesn't feel like failure. It feels like adherence to a standard that existed before you even arrived. On other days, you don't see anything at all. Not because you did something wrong, not because the animals aren't there, just because you weren't in the right place at the right time, or conditions weren't favourable, or they moved differently that day. The bush isn't arranged for your success. And heading home after a day like that, it doesn't feel empty. You're tired in a quiet way, not exhausted though. Your mind's been engaged for hours without the kind of stimulation that leaves you wired. There's a sense of completion even without a tangible result, because the goal wasn't guaranteed to begin with. You showed up, you paid attention, and you didn't force anything. And the landscape continues exactly as it did before you even arrived. And in a strange way, that feels appropriate. And occasionally, everything does line up. The wind holds, distance closes, the background is safe, your position is stable, nothing feels rushed or uncertain. When that happens, the moment isn't loud internally. It's almost the opposite. It's quiet, it's focused, it's procedural. Your breathing slows, movement becomes deliberate, your attention narrows to only what matters for doing it cleanly. And if a shot is taken, the decision feels like it was made long before the trigger was pulled. Then the situation changes completely, because now you've committed to whatever follows. Tracking, recovery, processing, all the practical realities that don't feature in the public imagination nearly as much as the shot itself. But again, those days are in a minority. Most of the time, the version I live is quiet, slow, and defined more by what didn't happen rather than by what did. And it doesn't produce many stories. It doesn't produce many photographs. It leaves very little behind to prove that it even occurred at all. And because so much of it leaves no visible trace, it barely overlaps with the version most people see from the outside. And that quiet, uneventful reality is precisely why the outside picture ends up looking so different. Most of what hunting actually involves doesn't translate well once you step away from it. The gap between what hunting feels like from the inside and how it looks from the outside isn't there because one side is lying. It's there because the two versions are built from completely different kinds of information. Public understanding tends to form around moments that are visible, or dramatic or emotionally charged. When hunting enters broader conversation, it's usually because something bad's happened, right? It's an incident or a controversial image or a political decision. It's a situation that already has enough intensity to travel. Ordinary days in the bush don't generate that kind of attention. No one writes headlines about someone walking for 6 hours and deciding not to take a shot. No one shares footage of a quiet morning when nothing happened. Even hunters don't tend to talk about these days in detail, because honestly, there isn't much to describe that would make much sense to someone who wasn't there. So what circulates publicly isn't typical. It's simply what's visible. And once those moments become the reference point, everything else gets interpreted through them. Opinions form around the examples people have actually seen, not the ones that exist quietly in the background. From the outside, that makes sense. If the only time something crosses your path is when it's dramatic or contentious, it's reasonable to assume that drama or contention is a defining feature of the activity itself. There are also strong positions at both ends of the spectrum. Some people believe hunting is inherently cruel and should not exist at all in a modern society. And from that perspective, questions about management and sustainability or tradition, they don't really change the conclusion. The act itself is the problem. And then on the other extreme, there are voices within the hunting world who see any restriction whatsoever as unnecessary. The idea that access should be broad and rules minimal and individual judgment should be sufficient. Most serious hunters I've met don't sit comfortably at either end. The reality on the ground tends to be far more constrained and far more practical. Access is regulated, seasons do exist, and methods are restricted. And in many places, you can only hunt on private land with permission, which means relationships with landowners matter as much as your skill set. Safety requirements are strict because they have to be. You're dealing with firearms. There's also an environmental dimension that doesn't fit neatly into either extreme. Here in Australia, many of the animals being hunted, they're not native, and they're officially classified as pests in certain contexts. Deer populations, for example, they've expanded dramatically in parts of the country over the past few decades. Governments spend large amounts of money attempting to control these populations through professional culling programs, including aerial operations that most people never see. Recreational hunters operate within that same landscape, but at ground level, over longer time frames, and often at their own expense rather than public cost. Some people view that as contribution to management, others see it as irrelevant or insufficient, and both views exist simultaneously. What's clear is that the reality doesn't resemble either a barbaric free-for-all or a pristine wilderness untouched by human intervention. It's a managed system with competing priorities: conservation, agriculture, public safety, animal welfare, recreation, all overlapping in ways that don't reduce to simple narratives. Even within hunting communities, there's a strong emphasis on sustainability and ethical conduct and maintaining access. And if populations collapse or public tolerances disappear, hunting disappears with it. So long-term thinking isn't abstract at all. It's self-preservation as well as responsibility. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone agrees on what responsible looks like, or that conflicts don't occur. They do, all the time. But the dominant tone in serious circles is usually cautious rather than reckless. And from the outside, those nuances are easy to miss. What travels further are the extreme examples, right? Either the most shocking incidents or the most strident defences. Moderate positions don't spread as widely because, well, they're less emotionally compelling, right? The hunting community itself contributes to this gap as well, sometimes unintentionally. Stories shared within the community, they often focus on success. It's a good stalk or a clean shot, a memorable animal. And there's nothing wrong with that. Not because people are trying to mislead anyone, but because those are the moments that feel worth telling to others who understand the context. The quiet days don't require explanation among people who already know they exist. But when those same stories reach people without that shared background, they can reinforce the idea that outcomes are the goal rather than the exception. Add cameras to the equation, and the effect intensifies. Filmed hunts, photos, social media posts, they naturally gravitate towards moments that are visually clear and narratively satisfying. No one sets up equipment to capture uneventful hours, right? Editing compresses time, context drops away. What remains is a sequence of meaningful moments that appear to follow one another more quickly than what they do in reality. And again, that isn't necessarily dishonest. It's simply how storytelling works. There's also a quieter factor. Hunting requires time, access, physical effort, and a willingness to accept uncertainty. For many people, even those who aren't morally opposed, those barriers alone keep it outside of their experience, so it remains abstract or something that other people do somewhere else. And abstract things are easier to categorize than to understand. Once an activity becomes symbolic rather than experiential, it starts being discussed in terms of what it represents rather than what it actually involves. Hunting can become shorthand for ideas about violence or tradition or environmental impact or rural identity or personal freedom, depending on who is speaking. When that happens, the real practice almost disappears behind the meanings projected onto it. And by this point, trying to correct the public picture starts to feel unrealistic. No individual hunter can counterbalance large-scale narratives, and no single explanation can recreate years of direct experience for someone who hasn't had it. And over time, most people stop trying to fix the gap and instead focus on maintaining their own standards regardless of how things are perceived. Not out of defeat, but just out of sheer pragmatism. You can control how you act. You can't control how that action will be interpreted once it leaves your hands. So, the emphasis shifts inwards. Do it properly. Do it safely. Respect the landowners and other users. Leave the place in good condition. Better yet, leave it in better condition than when you got there. If those fundamentals are intact, the external conversation matters less on a day-to-day level, even if it does still exist. None of this means the gap is harmless, or that misunderstanding has no consequences. Laws, access, and public tolerance all depend on broader opinion, right? But it does explain why the two versions continue to coexist without ever fully aligning. They're not different because one side is irrational or malicious. They're different because they're built from two different experiences. From observation at a distance, hunting can look abrupt and unnecessary or overly decisive. From participation up close, it feels slow and conditional and defined more by restraint than by action. Both views contain pieces of truth, but neither one captures the whole lot. And once you see that clearly, the gap stops feeling like something that needs to be solved immediately and starts looking more like a permanent feature on how the activity exists in modern Australia. Once you accept that the gap isn't going away anytime soon, the question becomes less about fixing it and more about how you choose to live with it, especially once your own involvement becomes visible to others. Now, living with hunting means accepting that it doesn't stay private just because you prefer it to. Even if you've never posted a photo and you've never talked about it in detail, you've never drawn any attention to it whatsoever, the activity still exists in a shared world. Laws shape it. Public opinion influences access. Decisions made by people who have never set foot in the bush can still determine what you're allowed to do once you're there. So, responsibility doesn't stop when you leave the field. I think for me, it mostly shows up in how I choose to talk about it, right? And what I choose not to turn into a performance. Usually in ordinary conversations rather than formal ones. I'm not interested in pretending hunting is something softer than it is. It involves taking an animal's life, and trying to dress that up or sanitize it feels dishonest, and people can usually sense that kind of avoidance immediately. But I'm also not interested in presenting it as spectacle. Most of hunting isn't exciting. Most of it doesn't resolve into a clean story. And when you only show the outcome, people naturally assume that the outcome was the goal all along. It usually isn't. By the time something actually happens, the important decisions have already been made, often hours or days earlier, sometimes years earlier in terms of learning. Positioning, safety, conditions, whether it's appropriate to act at all, the visible moment is just the end of a much longer chain. If you cut away everything before it, what's left can look abrupt or even careless, even when it wasn't. And that's why I'm careful about how things are presented. I'm not secretive and I'm not evasive, I'm just careful. If I share something, I want it to reflect what the experience actually felt like, not just what it looked like from a distance. And that means including uncertainty. It includes the waiting, the parts where nothing worked, the times I walked away. Otherwise, it stops being honest, even if the footage itself is real. There's also the reality that once an audience exists, some degree of performance is unavoidable. A camera changes behaviour, even if only slightly. Knowing something might be shared later affects how you frame it in your own mind. Now, that doesn't automatically invalidate the experience, but it does mean you have to stay aware of the influence. Now, the key thing for me is making sure that the performance doesn't start driving the decisions. The hunt comes first, the story comes later. And if those ever swap places, something important's shifted. I'm also not trying to persuade people who don't want to be persuaded. That just feels unnecessary and honestly, a bit exhausting. People are allowed to sit wherever they sit on this. Some will never be comfortable with hunting, regardless of context, and others will be curious but uncertain. Others, again, will already understand it well. Trying to win everyone over usually just hardens positions. All I can do is speak plainly about my own experience and let people take from it whatever they will. Now, tone matters as well. Getting defensive tends to escalate things rather than clarify them. Aggression guarantees you'll only be heard by people who already agree with you. So I try to keep it calm. Not because I'm trying to appear reasonable, but because it's genuinely how it feels internally. I'm not angry about this. I'm not fighting anyone. I'm just describing something that's a part of my life. And sometimes that means saying less than I could. Not every situation needs a full explanation. If someone's genuinely interested, you can tell. The questions are open and they're not confrontational. And if they aren't, more detail won't change the outcome. Silence can be a form of respect too. There are also experiences that probably should remain private. Not because they're shameful, but because they lose something when they're turned into a content or discussion. Some moments matter precisely because they aren't performed afterwards. And keeping those to yourself isn't secrecy, it's preservation. And I've become comfortable with that. Misunderstanding doesn't feel like an emergency anymore. It's just a part of living in a society where most people don't share the same reference points. Expecting universal agreement would be unrealistic. What matters more is whether I'm acting in a way I can stand behind if context disappears. If all someone ever sees is the end result without the backstory. If I'm comfortable with that, then I'm probably on solid ground. Responsibility in public ends up looking fairly simple. Don't exaggerate. Don't pretend. Don't chase attention. Don't let the presence of an audience change decisions that you would have made anyway. Everything else is secondary. That doesn't mean avoiding visibility altogether, right? Sharing experiences can build understanding. It can build community and continuity across generations. It can also invite scrutiny, disagreement, and misunderstanding. Both outcomes come with the territory. The point isn't to control the response, it's to remain aligned with the practice itself. If what you show matches what you actually do when no one is watching, then the visibility doesn't distort much. If it starts to diverge, if the narrative becomes more important than the reality, that's when things begin to drift. Now, by this point in my own journey, that alignment matters more than approval. I'm not trying to represent hunting as a whole, and I'm not trying to be an ambassador for anything. I'm just trying to move through it in a way that feels consistent, whether the experience remains private or becomes visible later. Acceptance isn't something I can control. Consistency is. Living with that balance between private experience and public perception doesn't just affect how you speak about hunting. Over time, it starts to shape how you move through the world more generally. Now, spending time in that gap between the public version of hunting and the lived one changes things in a way that aren't obvious at first. Not dramatic personality shifts, not a new identity, more like subtle adjustments in how you move through ordinary situations. Patience is the most noticeable one. Not the forced kind where you're trying to be calm, but a quieter tolerance for uncertainty. In the bush, you get used to the idea that effort doesn't guarantee outcome. You can prepare properly, you can show up consistently, you can do everything right and still go home empty-handed. Over time, that stops feeling like failure and starts feeling like a normal part of how the world works. That perspective, it doesn't stay confined to hunting. It carries into other parts of life. Work, family, projects. Anywhere results are uncertain. You become less reactive when things don't unfold on your preferred timeline because you internalize how often timing is outside of your control. Attention changes too. You start noticing small things more readily. Not because you're trying to be observant, but because you've trained yourself to look for subtle cues that matter. Movement at the edge of vision, or changes in sound, patterns that repeat over time. That habit doesn't switch off when you leave the field. Even driving through the hills, you find yourself scanning tree lines or noticing weather shifts, registering details you would have ignored before. It's not intrusive, it's just a background awareness that wasn't there previously. Comfort with solitude increases as well. Many hunts involve long stretches with no conversation, no stimulation between what's immediately around you. Now, at first that can feel slow or even boring, but eventually it becomes restful. You realize how much mental noise normal life contains and how little of it is actually necessary. This doesn't mean you withdraw from people, it just means that being alone stops feeling like something that needs to be filled. Risk perception adjusts too. Not in a reckless direction, if anything, the opposite. Handling firearms safely or navigating rough terrain and making decisions with real consequences encourages a more deliberate approach to risk overall. You become aware of how quickly small mistakes can compound and how preventable most serious problems are with just a little bit of foresight. That awareness tends to make everyday risks look more manageable rather than more frightening. There's also a deeper shift in how you understand the life cycle itself. Before spending time in wild places, it's easy to imagine nature as balanced, even gentle in some abstract way. Documentaries often focus on beauty or on dramatic predation. But the ordinary endings, the slow ones, they rarely get shown. In reality, most wild animals don't die peacefully. Old animals weaken until they can't compete for food. Injuries that would be survivable with treatment become fatal because treatment doesn't exist in the wild. Infection, parasites, broken limbs, drought, any of these can turn a functioning animal into one that simply can't keep up anymore. Starvation is common, more common than we would like to believe. It's not dramatic, it's just gradual. An animal that was alert and mobile weeks earlier becomes thin. It's slower and then it eventually just disappears. Predators, scavengers, and the environment itself finish the process. Nothing is wasted, but nothing is gentle either. Even animals that aren't sick or injured live under constant pressure. For many species, survival depends on staying alert every single waking moment, feeding efficiently and avoiding predators, enduring weather, competing with others of their own kind. There isn't a retirement phase. Life continues until it doesn't. Seeing that repeatedly changes how you think about death. Not in a desensitizing way, but in a very grounding way. Death stops feeling like an abnormal interruption and starts looking like a built-in part of the system. Every organism is temporary, every advantage conditional, and every injury potentially decisive. It also reframes the act of taking an animal. Because a clean, immediate death, something hunters spend a great deal of time trying to achieve, sits within a spectrum where many natural deaths are neither clean nor immediate. Now, that doesn't make it morally simple, but it does place it inside a broader context rather than isolating it as uniquely violent. Food looks different too. When you've handled an animal from field to table, meat stops being a neutral commodity. It has weight. Not just physical weight, but conceptual weight. You know exactly what had to occur for it to exist. Waste feels inappropriate in a way that's hard to explain until you've experienced it. Even supermarket meat stops feeling anonymous. You're aware that the process happened somewhere, even if you weren't part of it. That abstraction is gone. There's also a humbling aspect. Humans are physically fragile compared to most animals that live permanently outdoors. Right? We don't have fur, we don't have claws, we don't have a thick hide or specialized senses. Remove modern tools and infrastructure, and we're not particularly well equipped to survive harsh conditions for long. Injuries that would be inconvenient in daily life can become serious quickly in the wilderness. Infection, exposure, dehydration, things that sound manageable in theory feel much less abstract when you're far from immediate help. It reminds you that our dominance as a species comes from cooperation and technology and culture, not from individual physical resilience. Strip those away, and we're just another soft-skinned mammal trying to avoid the same hazards as everything else. And that realization doesn't feel threatening. If anything, it produces a strange kind of calm. You become aware of how dependent we are on systems that normally operate invisibly. Healthcare, infrastructure, food supply, communication. You also gain respect for how difficult life is for creatures that navigate those challenges without any of those supports. Survival in the wild isn't heroic. It's constant. And most animals manage it until something eventually goes wrong. Because eventually, something always goes wrong. None of this turns hunting into something casual or insignificant. If anything, it reinforces the seriousness of the decision. You're intervening in a system that will continue without you. The responsibility isn't just legal or ethical, it's ecological and practical as well. But it does strip away certain illusions. Nature isn't a sanctuary from death. It isn't orderly or fair. It doesn't distribute outcomes based on effort or virtue. It simply operates according to conditions. And seeing that up close makes human debates about what is natural feel both important and strangely detached at the same time. Important because our decisions do have real consequences. Detached because the system itself is indifferent to our interpretations of it. Conversation habits shift too. You become less inclined to argue in absolute terms about things you haven't experienced directly. It becomes obvious how much nuance disappears when complex activities are reduced to simple positions. And that doesn't mean you stop having opinions, just that you hold them a bit more loosely when you're outside your own area of experience. Perhaps the most subtle change, though, is the internal one. It's a sense of proportion. In the bush, your concerns don't disappear, but they shrink to a size that feels more accurate. Deadlines, minor frustrations, social tensions, they don't stop mattering, but they do stop feeling all-consuming. You're reminded that the world operates on scales much larger than whatever happens to be occupying your thoughts that week. When you return to normal life, those concerns expand again, but the memory of that wider context remains. Now, none of these changes are exclusive to hunting. People find similar shifts through many activities that demand attention and patience and accountability. Hunting's just one pathway. And none of them make you better than anyone else. If anything, I think they make you more aware of how partial your perspective still is, and how much remains outside your experience, how easy it is to draw conclusions from incomplete information. That awareness circles back to the gap this episode's been describing. Once you've seen how different something can feel from the inside compared to how it appears from the outside, it becomes harder to assume you fully understand other complex things you haven't lived yourself. You don't become neutral. You just become more cautious about certainty. And perhaps that's the most meaningful change of all. Not confidence, not authority, but a quieter form of humility. One that comes from direct experience rather from being told to be humble. Which brings me back to the question that sits quietly behind all of this. Given all of that, a reasonable question is why talk about it at all? If hunting is mostly quiet, mostly private, and often misunderstood, it'd be simpler to keep it that way. Many people do. They hunt, and they process the experience internally or within a small circle, and return to everyday life without feeling any need to explain themselves beyond that. I understand that instinct, I do. There are days when it still feels like the most sensible option. But I also remember how opaque this world felt before I stepped into it, how little I understood, How many assumptions I carried without realizing it. How difficult it was to find accounts that weren't either romanticized or confrontational. It often felt like you were expected to pick a side before you even knew what the thing actually was. What helped most weren't arguments or polished narratives, right? It was hearing ordinary experiences described plainly by people who didn't seem to be trying to prove anything. People who were comfortable admitting uncertainty or complexity or even ambivalence. People who sounded like they were still working it out rather than presenting a finished philosophy. And that made the activity feel less like a symbol and more like a real thing done by real people. This project sits somewhere in that space. Not as a defense of hunting and not as an attempt to recruit anyone into it. More like a record of what it feels like to move through this world at a particular point in time with a particular level of experience before hindsight smooths everything into a cleaner story like we have a tendency to do. Now, some listeners will relate to that and some will disagree with parts of it. Some will decide it isn't for them at all. And all of those responses are reasonable. I'm not trying to resolve the broader debate or present a definitive position. I'm documenting a process, learning in public, making mistakes in public, adjusting in public. And that approach carries its own risks, but it also feels more honest than pretending the understanding was always there. If my perspective changes later, that change will be visible too. Not because inconsistency is the goal, but because development usually isn't linear. You circle back to things and you reconsider. You see them differently as your experience grows. And speaking about it doesn't close the gap between public perception and lived reality. At best, it places one small, incomplete account into that space. Maybe that makes the activity slightly less abstract, I don't know. A voice instead of an image, a process instead of a moment. Beyond that, I don't have a particular outcome in mind. Hunting will continue whether I talk about it or not. Public opinion will shift in ways I can't predict. Access, regulation, and cultural attitudes will evolve according to forces much larger than any individual perspective. My own understanding will probably keep evolving as well. For now, though, I think this is simply just where I stand. Not at the end of a journey, not at the beginning either. Just somewhere in the middle, describing the view from here while it's still unfinished. And perhaps that's the most honest place to speak from. I'm Ben McGorm. This is Wild Harvest.